August 1945, Norfolk, Virginia. The grey Atlantic heaved beyond the breakwater, while rain hung in the air like breath that would not fall. Winches creaked, gulls pierced the damp with thin cries, and the transport's salt-whitened hull rubbed the pier as the gangway dropped. They had rehearsed the worst, jeers, cuffs, a march into darkness, and braced themselves for it. Instead, the first shock rose on the wind, a warm, greasy sweetness that cut through coal smoke and bilge, the unmistakable smell of meat searing on iron. They came ashore in file, 300 women in faded field grey skirts and service coats, insignia clipped away, belts surrendered. Most were auxiliaries from Wehrmacht signals and Luftwaffe clerical detachments, wrists still lined where headphones or straps had rubbed. The chronology moved with military plainness. Ship made fast, roster called, kit stacked, search concluded. Then the guards, silent, watchful M1 slings dark with rain, gestured them along a crushed shell path toward a wire-fenced yard, where canvas roofs trapped heat. Beyond the mesh stood rows of steel griddles, each hissing as fat met iron. American cooks in denim aprons turned steaks with practiced economy. Smoke curled, pepper stung, and the scent thickened into something almost unreal for those who had lived on ersatz and ration starch. The first tray clattered metal on metal, an ordinary sound that cracked the silence more than any speech. On plates, browned meat bled onto white bread. Urns breathed coffee, salt clung to lips. A former teleprinter clerk would later write that the first bite felt like waking into noise after years of static. Peace, arriving as calories instead of questions, proved stranger than surrender. To understand how these women reached this pier and why, captivity began with abundance rather than punishment. The story must step back to the roots that carried them here and the policies that shaped their fate. Between 1939 and 1945, the German war machine depended not only on its soldiers, but on an army of women who served in its shadow. They were called Helferinnen, helpers drawn from schools, factories, and offices, molded by the state into instruments of efficiency and belief. By the war's height, nearly 500,000 of them filled the ranks of the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine auxiliaries. They manned switchboards, decoded radio traffic, filed casualty reports, and kept the machinery of total war humming long after the front itself had collapsed. Most had been raised under the banner of the League of German Girls, the BDM, where duty was sanctified and obedience rehearsed in song. For them, the Reich was not merely politics but purpose. To serve was to be chosen. By 1944, that certainty began to dissolve. Allied armies punched through Normandy, Soviet forces tore across the Vistula, and the women who had once typed victory communiques now heard artillery through open windows. At command posts from Caen to Bremen, they witnessed evacuation orders written on their own ledgers. Many burned files, others fled convoys, but thousands were overtaken by the speed of defeat. When capture came, it came without warning. American jeeps rolling up to bunkers, British MPs waving white handkerchiefs, a shouted "Hände hoch," followed by silence. Their commanders had warned them that Allied captivity meant starvation, humiliation, perhaps worse. Some swallowed the lies whole. Others, numbed by exhaustion, surrendered to what they thought would be their undoing. Instead, they met an order shaped not by vengeance, but by law. In camps administered under the 1929 Geneva Convention, they found rations weighed to the ounce, medical inspections by schedule, and interrogations conducted in polite English or halting German. The Americans, unprepared for such numbers, built entire systems to manage them. Rail convoys, processing centers, ration chains, turning a continent of victors into reluctant custodians. To feed the enemy and to do so well would become one of the strangest moral logistics of the post-war moment. By the spring of 1945, America had become an accidental empire of prisoners. More than 425,000 Axis captives, German, Italian, and a scattering of Japanese, were dispersed across some 500 main and branch camps, stretching from the arid flats of Texas to the snow-swept edges of Wisconsin. What had begun in 1942 as a modest internment effort for captured North African troops expanded after D-Day into a vast logistical network absorbing nearly 1,000 new German prisoners each day. Wooden barracks, once meant for training exercises, were repurposed with barbed wire and floodlights. State fairgrounds, horse tracks, and abandoned CCC sites became fenced microcosms of a defeated Europe. The War Department soon faced a dilemma, both moral and political. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment, including adequate rations and medical care, but public sentiment bristled at the idea of feeding Nazis like heroes while ration books at home still limited butter and meat. Nevertheless, the regulations held. Each prisoner was to receive the same daily caloric allotment. As an American soldier, about 3,200 calories distributed through the same quartermaster system that sustained the U.S. Army. They were served bread baked from Midwestern wheat, milk condensed in Illinois, and beef drawn from the same shipments that supplied bases abroad. Officials reasoned that to mistreat prisoners was to invite reciprocal cruelty toward Allied captives still in German hands. When the first female auxiliaries arrived, however, the bureaucratic machinery hesitated. No manuals described how to feed or quarter enemy women. At Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, and Camp Shanks, New York, fenced compounds were hastily converted under the supervision of the Women's Army Corps. Guards, clerks, and cooks, all female, administered the enclosures, enforcing regulation with restraint. Within days, the newcomers saw posted menus that listed steak, potatoes, and coffee, items absent from German tables for years. To them it felt impossible, almost theatrical, until the first tray appeared and steam rose into the humid air. In those mess halls, food became more than sustenance. It became a quiet weapon of principle, a demonstration that America's victory was not only military, but moral. In August 1945, amid the balance sheets and requisition forms of the U.S. Quartermaster Corps, one entry stood out like an error: beef fresh, 4 PW rations. At a time when much of Europe survived on watery soup and black bread, America was issuing prime cuts of meat to its captives. Ships arriving from domestic suppliers offloaded butter, flour, and coffee into warehouses marked prisoner of war supply. The numbers were audacious. Tons of food moved daily, not for soldiers in battle, but for those who had already lost. In Washington, some legislators grumbled that the policy coddled the enemy. But within the War Department, a quieter logic prevailed. Army psychologists, citing early studies in morale and re-education, claimed that consistent nourishment and fair treatment could do what propaganda could not: dismantle fanaticism by confronting it with decency. Thus emerged an unintended diplomacy of the dinner table. In places like Camp Ruston, Louisiana, and Camp Aliceville, Alabama, menus blurred the lines between captor and captive. German POWs ate baked potatoes beside the same roast cuts served to guards. Cooks joked that it was the most orderly restaurant in America. The women among them, few but unforgettable, came from cities flattened by bombing: Cologne, Hamburg, Berlin, where hunger had become a measure of survival. When they were handed plates heavy with steak, some hesitated as though expecting a blow. Others wept. The shock of warmth, salt, and abundance struck deeper than interrogation ever could. For years they had been told the Allies were barbarians. Now the proof of the opposite sizzled before them. Reports preserved in camp files described notebooks confiscated from female prisoners containing sketches, poems, and fragments of confession. One line appeared again and again: the madness of kindness. It baffled American officers who saw only procedure where their prisoners saw revelation. But for many of those women, the meal itself marked a rupture, a moment when defeat ceased to mean degradation, and the idea of mercy began to feel real. April 1945. The Reich was collapsing in on itself, a continent of noise and fire. Along the roads west of Berlin, women in grey field uniforms moved with the debris of armies: stretcher bearers, typists, and teleprinter operators, still carrying their signal satchels as if the front might call again. From Hanover to Bremen, through the ruins of the Ruhr pocket, they were rounded up by British and Canadian patrols, advancing through towns where the church bells had stopped and white flags hung from shattered windows. Most had been attached to communications and medical units. A few had worn Luftwaffe insignia until the day they were ordered to tear them off. In the confusion, many believed capture meant violation or death. Instead, they were processed, searched, recorded, and placed behind wire under a grey sky that smelled of cordite and spring rain. From those temporary cages, a strange bureaucracy took over. Trucks brought them to Antwerp and Le Havre, where vast transit depots funneled captured Germans into Allied custody. There they encountered something unprecedented: American officers with clipboards, Red Cross translators, and rows of tents marked PW Transit. Within days, lists were drawn up for transfer across the Atlantic. The women, clerks, medics, dispatchers were told they would be relocated for security and processing. Few understood it meant America. They were loaded onto Liberty ships, the same freighters that had carried bombs and fuel eastward, now repurposed to haul the defeated West. The voyages lasted 10 to 14 days. The Atlantic in spring was cruel, pitching and cold, but the rules held: each prisoner received full rations, water, and basic medical inspection. Armed guards patrolled the decks, but hostility had ebbed into weariness. Some guards lent cigarettes. Others shared chocolate, a quiet gesture of the war's end. Below decks, fear simmered. Rumors whispered through the bunks that Americans killed prisoners or used them for experiments. But when the engines slowed near the Virginia coast and the first smell of grilled meat drifted through the vents, a different confusion spread. No one spoke. The scent rose steady and impossible until disbelief itself became silence. Hours later, when the gangplanks dropped, they would step into a world that defied everything they had been taught to expect. Late August 1945, Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. The morning air was heavy with pine resin and the aftertaste of rain. Trucks rolled through the main gate, engines idling as their cargo climbed down. German women in faded uniforms, eyes fixed on the gravel. Armed guards stood in formation, their weapons slung but unmoving. The prisoners had spent days crossing the Atlantic, imagining cages, starvation, or interrogation. Instead, what awaited them was order. Rows of whitewashed barracks, flower beds lining the walkways, and the faint hum of an American camp waking to routine. Birds called over the wire. Nothing fit the stories they had been told. They were marched toward the mess hall, a low building whose tin roof glinted under the noon sun. As the doors opened, a wave of warmth and scent struck them. Onions sautéing in butter, the heavy sweetness of gravy, and the unmistakable smell of frying beef. The sound of ladles on metal trays echoed down the line. One woman, a teleprinter clerk from Bremen, stopped short, convinced it was a ruse meant to test their obedience. A corporal, neither cruel nor kind, motioned again. She stepped forward. On the tray lay a steak, seared and pink at the center. Beside mashed potatoes, a soft roll and a square of butter already melting in the heat. A Red Cross matron poured coffee into enamel mugs. Her accent clipped but her tone calm. No one spoke. The prisoners stared at the food, some trembling, others frozen by the unreality of abundance. One whispered that it might be poisoned. Another prayed under her breath. Finally, a young radio operator raised her fork, cut once, and tasted. The silence cracked. "If this is defeat," she murmured, "then it's different than we were told." From the back of the hall, an American camp officer recorded in his log, "Visible relaxation, tears, confusion. In that moment, discipline gave way to something unplanned, recognition." The women had been conquered by force, but what followed was subtler. The disarming power of mercy delivered one plate at a time. The American system of prisoner care in 1945 did not arise from sentiment, but from statute. Nearly 2 decades earlier, the 1929 Geneva Convention had bound its signatories to treat captured soldiers with the same humanity owed to their own. The United States, though spared invasion, enforced the agreement with meticulous precision. The Judge Advocate General's Office circulated field manuals detailing everything from the dimensions of POW bunks to the caloric balance of their meals. Each camp commandant was reminded that violations would not only dishonor the Army, but endanger American captives still held overseas. Equality of treatment was not negotiable. It was the law. For female prisoners, the provisions went further. Under the watch of the International Red Cross, new guidelines mandated privacy screens, medical examinations by female staff, and access to sanitary supplies. These were small things in the eyes of administrators, but immense in the memory of those who had gone without even soap for months. American quartermasters, bound by both conscience and code, issued food from the same deliveries used for base personnel: steak, eggs, milk, bread, coffee. There was no enemy ration, Only the same measure weighed for all under the flag. Across the Atlantic, the contrast was cruelly visible. In shattered German cities, civilians bartered for potatoes and coal, while their captured daughters were being fed in distant safety. Through Swiss intermediaries, reports filtered back to what remained of Berlin's ministries. One surviving intelligence summary lamented that the enemy's mercy undermines our faith. It was an admission more cutting than defeat itself, that compassion could succeed where ideology had failed. In that paradox, food became an instrument of reconstruction, a silent pedagogy of fairness. The Geneva Convention, intended as law, had evolved into a lesson, one that would turn captivity into the first classroom of democracy. October 1945, barely 2 months after surrender, the silence between continents began to break. Through the mediation of the International Red Cross, the U.S. War Department permitted a small but significant gesture. Censored letters from female POWs could be sent home. The paper was thin, the ink faint, and every line passed through the hands of American censors. Yet the voices that emerged were startlingly human. "We are fed better than we were at home," wrote one woman from Fort Oglethorpe. Another added, "There is meat every day, and we are treated like people, not prisoners." In the ruins of Germany, where ration cards promised little and delivered less, such words landed like thunder. The letters traveled through Switzerland, then across a broken postal network to cities still smelling of ash and hunger. Families gathered in cold apartments to read them aloud by candlelight. Mothers wept. Neighbors doubted. For years, propaganda had promised that Allied capture meant cruelty or death. Now their daughters wrote of warmth, medicine, and food served without mockery. In the American zone of occupation, newspapers reprinted selected passages under Allied supervision, hoping to puncture despair and disarm resentment. One column quoted a young Luftwaffe typist whose words seemed to speak for all. The smell of steak replaced fear with hunger, and hunger with gratitude. Not all felt comfort. Some women confessed shame that they ate well, while their families scavenged through rubble. The Red Cross observers noted a curious side effect within the camps. Discipline improved sharply after the first proper meal. Obedience no longer came from fear, but from a dawning sense of mutual recognition. Compassion, it seemed, was contagious. What began as administrative decency had become psychological strategy, a quiet experiment in how kindness might neutralize hatred faster than punishment ever. Beneath the surface of mercy ran a vein of strategy. By late 1945, American military psychologists, many attached to the Army's reorientation division, had begun treating the POW camps as laboratories for ideological reform. Their hypothesis was simple but profound. Before minds could be opened, bodies had to be fed. Hunger bred resentment, satiety reflection. At installations such as Fort Getty in Rhode Island and Camp Shanks in New York, this theory took form. The routine began with the mess hall. Full plates, warm rooms, familiar smells of coffee and meat, and only afterward came the lectures on democracy, freedom of the press, and civic duty. Officers observed a consistent pattern. After eating, prisoners listened rather than resisted. The arrangement was deliberate. Dining was not just sustenance but choreography. Guards and prisoners often ate in sight of one another, sometimes even sharing leftovers from the same kitchen. For women who had lived within the rigid hierarchies of the Nazi state, taught to revere rank, fear men, and serve silently, such equality was disorienting. Here, the uniformed American woman of the Women's Army Corps issued orders with calm confidence yet without cruelty. Red Cross staff spoke to them as peers. Gradually, curiosity replaced defiance. Some prisoners volunteered in camp kitchens, peeling potatoes beside their keepers. Others joined English classes, drawn less by obligation than by the novelty of open conversation. By 1946, the War Department's reorientation reports documented a steady shift in attitude. Fewer declarations of loyalty to Hitler, more interest in Allied reconstruction and international news. One analyst wrote with astonishment, "Steak did what sermons could not." The table had become an instrument of persuasion, the meal a symbol of equality. But this quiet transformation carried a cost. Feeding compassion required resources on a scale few nations could sustain. The next challenge would test America's generosity against scarcity itself. how to nourish thousands of former enemies while the world around them starved. Feeding mercy required machinery. Between 1944 and 1946, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps performed one of the most complex supply operations in its history, sustaining an army of the defeated. More than 2 million pounds of food moved each week through a network of depots, rail lines, and refrigerated trucks to hundreds of POW camps scattered across the American heartland. Each prisoner was allocated roughly 3,000 calories per day, a figure calculated with military precision and recorded in ledgers that read like battlefield logistics: beef tonnage, grain carloads, dairy shipments. The same organization that had once supplied Patton's Third Army now fed the enemy it had subdued. Every month, Red Cross inspectors checked rations and kitchens, ensuring parity between guard and captive. At facilities housing women, nutritionists added milk and meat to combat malnutrition caused by wartime scarcity. Local farmers signed contracts to deliver fresh produce and beef, often from government surplus stores originally reserved for U.S. troops. But the generosity stirred resentment. When newspapers revealed that German prisoners were eating steak, while American families still used ration books, letters of protest poured into Congress. Yet the War Department stood firm. Officials argued that such treatment was not indulgence but identity, proof that democracy upheld its own ideals even when tested by its enemies. "How we treat them shows who we are," one press release declared. Irony threaded through the system. At many camps, POWs worked on nearby farms, harvesting corn, cotton, and cattle feed that would later return to their own tables. They became both producers and beneficiaries of the same abundance, participants in an economy of reconciliation. The endless paperwork of the Quartermaster Corps concealed a moral experiment, whether compassion could be measured in tons, shipped by rail, and served 3 times a day. Over time, that routine would turn sustenance into transformation. By the end of 1945, the chaos of surrender had faded into a strange, steady rhythm. At camps like Fort Oglethorpe, life was measured not by alarms or air raids, but by bells marking meals and roll call. The female POWs woke before sunrise, folded their blankets with military precision, and swept the barracks until the scent of breakfast drifted through the compound. Tin trays clattered, coffee hissed in urns. The same steak dinners that had once felt impossible now arrived by habit, grilled, portioned, dependable. What had begun as shock was slowly becoming security. Routine, the great equalizer of soldiers and captives alike, began to heal what ideology had broken. Many of the women took to small duties: clerical work, sewing, tending to infirmary beds, grateful for structure after years of displacement. Conversation followed. Guards traded English words for German ones over trays of food. A cook demonstrated how to make cornbread, while a former Luftwaffe secretary offered a recipe for potato dumplings. In the infirmary, a Red Cross nurse noted the change in posture and eyes. They no longer flinch when spoken to. Army psychologists called it progressive emotional normalization, but within the fences it felt simpler, people learning. Again, how to be ordinary. The compound gardens became symbols of that ordinariness. Women planted mint, parsley, and dill in neat rows, herbs that scented the air with reminders of home. Occasionally, on appreciation days, they prepared German stews or strudels for the staff, laughter mixing with the clink of dishes. Around those shared tables, the war seemed to dissolve into something human-sized, a quiet truce born from repetition and respect. By 1946, repatriation orders began to arrive. The women who had once feared captivity now feared release. Beyond the wire waited a homeland in ruins, where food was scarce and kindness rarer still. The stake and civility of their captivity would linger like an unreal memory, proof that even defeat could contain unexpected grace. By the spring of 1946, the season of return began. Under the vast logistics of Operation Keelhaul, trains carried groups of female POWs eastward to embarkation ports at New York and Norfolk. The same Liberty ships that had once ferried them into captivity were now refitted for repatriation, their holds scrubbed clean, bunks refitted with canvas and wool blankets. Departure lists were read out in the mess halls, where they had learned to eat without fear. Before boarding, each camp held a farewell meal, an echo of that first bewildering feast months earlier. There were steaks, steaming coffee, and even small cakes baked from rationed flour. An American officer, reading from notes in his pocket, spoke simply. "Tell them what you saw here." The women packed their few possessions, Red Cross notebooks, faded photographs, and fragments of a mercy they could neither explain nor dismiss. As the ships turned toward the Atlantic, some wrote final letters home describing not hardship, but fairness. Their disbelief had hardened into gratitude, their suspicion into quiet respect. In Bremerhaven, they disembarked into a world unrecognizable. Cities reduced to ash, families displaced, hunger again the national language. Many found their accounts of American decency dismissed as fantasy or betrayal. Yet historians would later trace the subtle influence of those voices. Some of the returnees joined civic relief groups and women's councils that shaped West Germany's moral reconstruction. Citing captivity as the moment their understanding of justice had changed, the story ended where it began, with a meal. The last thing they tasted in America was not punishment but abundance. Hot coffee, bread, and the unmistakable flavor of moral victory served without triumph. It was proof that strength could be measured not by conquest, but by compassion. In the decades that followed, historians came to regard the American treatment of prisoners as one of World War II's quiet victories, a moral achievement obscured at the time by louder triumphs of arms and industry. While much of the world remembered the war through its atrocities, the death marches, the camps, the frozen trenches of the Eastern Front, the United States POW program, revealed another dimension of power: restraint. Feeding the enemy, when one's allies starved and the homeland rationed, had been an ethical gamble. Yet it yielded dividends no weapon could match. By proving that decency could survive total war, America set the tone for a peace built not merely on surrender, but on trust. Female POW memoirs that surfaced in the 1950s and 1960s captured this transformation with an intimacy no archive could rival. Many began with that same unassuming moment, the smell of steak in a strange mess hall. One former Luftwaffe clerk wrote, "They fed us as if we mattered, and that broke something inside me." Another remembered the bewildering tenderness of the Red Cross nurses who handed out coffee as if we were neighbors, not enemies. These recollections spread quietly across a recovering Germany, their moral echo shaping early post-war reconciliation more effectively than any speech. What had begun as a logistical necessity evolved into a parable of civilization. That strength lay not in domination but in dignity. The story of meat and mercy, once dismissed as sentimental, became evidence that even amid ruin ethics could prevail. It was proof that victory defined by compassion endures longer than any empire, and that in the ruins of hatred, humanity's greatest triumph is the choice to feed rather than to destroy. History often counts its victories in divisions, tonnage, and treaties, but the truer triumphs sometimes come on a plate, not a battlefield. For the women who stepped from troop ships in 1945 expecting punishment and hunger, the first bite of steak rewrote what defeat could mean. In that single act, the enemy fed, not starved, mercy proved stronger than vengeance. It showed that compassion could disarm where armies could not, that the simplest gesture of nourishment could silence years of indoctrination. As the decades passed and the last of those women faded from living memory, their letters and recollections remained. Across archives and memoirs ran a single thread. The smell of meat cooking behind barbed wire was, to them, the scent of civilization surviving its own collapse. War had taken everything: uniforms, illusions, even names, but not the world's capacity for decency. In the end, what they remembered of America was not the fences, nor the watchtowers, but the meals offered without contempt. Each tray, each cup of coffee, spoke the same quiet message: you are still human. The story closes where it began, in the rising smoke of a camp grill, where heat and mercy mingled in the same air. There, in the unremarkable ritual of feeding the conquered, the first peace of a new age was born, not signed or declared, but served. The taste outlived the war, and so did the lesson: that the measure of victory is not what we destroy, but what we choose to preserve.